Welcome to Chapter 10, where we talk about reading assessments. I'll be going through these slides rather quickly because we've talked about many of the aspects of standardized achievement testing in other chapters. We're going to just narrow that focus a little bit more specifically here in the context of reading. For reading assessment, we do have the option of standardized tests like the Wyatt or the KTEA that you've given, or criterion referenced or more locally developed, less formal assessment measures. Again, just as always, standardized assessment measures really have the benefit of being a good comparison of the child's skills to that of peers in a national sample. It's good for identifying areas of need. It's good for identifying the relevance or the significance of a child's reading problem. Criterion reference tests are most useful for identifying a little bit more specifically what deficits the child has. They're really good at providing a comprehensive description of what the child can and cannot do, and they are most useful for planning programs, designing interventions, or developing IEPs. Reading is considered of paramount importance because it's considered a gateway skill to other areas of achievement. It's really important that students have solid reading skills before they're able to move on and access many other areas of the curriculum. So when prioritizing needs for students, if reading is one of those needs, it's often important to consider and address any reading needs potentially before moving on to other areas. There are a lot of different sub areas that may require intervention for students in reading. Some of them include fluency, phonics, recognizing words, decoding, and comprehension. When conducting assessment for the IEP, it's considered not best practice to rely only on standardized norm referenced achievement data. So if your student has been through an ETR recently and you have data from a test like the Wyatt or the KTEA, that's great to use in your present level of performance, but you would need to supplement that data with additional information. It's really the best practice to use a combination approach and to also incorporate information from criterion referenced, curriculum based, or other informal assessments like reading inventories that you may have. Collecting data for reading is very important. Reading skills are very sensitive to change, meaning that you can see students making progress very quickly, very rapidly in response to intervention. So the skills are very easily measured and they should be monitored on a frequent basis to make sure that interventions are effective. Reading skills are not skills where we would consider it appropriate to check in at the end of the 9 weeks. It's really something where we should have ongoing, pretty rapid assessments going on. A couple of different reading strategies would include decoding, which looks at the pronouncing or sounding out of printed text and really looks at interpreting the written symbols involved in text. So transferring those written symbols into sounds and turning those sounds into words. That's what we talk about when we look at the area of decoding. Comprehension is a higher level skill that involves assigning some meaning to the printed element of text or understanding what is read. Evidence-based instruction in reading should really occur at a variety of levels, kind of starting with the most basic of phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, oral reading, vocabulary and comprehension. This really sort of looks at the developmental sequence that is inherent in learning to read, and it would be considered appropriate to start with phonemic awareness and build on those skills, working all the way up to the highest level of reading skill, which is comprehension or getting meaning from text. The idea of phonemic awareness is really one of the most basic early literacy skills that students learn, and this refers to the ability to recognize that words are made up of individual sounds, that there are individual sounds in words, and those sounds sequenced together form the actual words themselves. The individual sounds within a word are noted as phonemes, And phonological processing refers to the ability to discriminate between phonemes. So to understand that these letters have a different sound than other letters. Also looks at things like rhyming, sequencing sounds, and recall. To assess phonemic awareness, we can use a variety of different measures. These really are best evaluated with curriculum-based or criterion reference tests. We can evaluate phonemic or basic early literacy skills with standardized measures like the Wyatt or the KTEA. But again, those provide kind of an overall view of the child's skills, whereas these other and more informal measures drill down a little bit deeper and give us a greater, more broad understanding of exactly what skills the child has and where their needs may be. The DIBELS evaluation stands for Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills. They're considered dynamic because they are sensitive and responsive to change. They have some subtests called initial sound fluency, phoneme segmentation fluency, letter naming fluency, and these are skills that can be measured as early as the preschool years to get a good indicator of students who have effective or appropriate development in their early literacy, so that we can provide intervention and remediation as soon as possible. There's often quite a bit of overlap between students who have phonemic awareness deficits and students who have speech and language impairments. So the speech and language pathologist may be involved in the monitoring or the measuring, and even in the intervention of some of students who struggle with these sound symbol relationships, especially in the early childhood years. Decoding is talking about a student's ability to recognize words. So looking at their ability to sound out words, their ability to put sounds and words together, and their ability to get through or decode, sound out the text. Sight vocabulary are words that we recognize just by sight. They're words that don't follow traditional phonemic rules. Things like the Dolch sight word or the Fry word list are words that we all read or recognize by sight alone. Phonics really is the opposite of that, which really looks at a student's ability to sound out the words, putting all the sounds together to sound out the entire word. And these are really two distinct skills, being able to decode or recognize words by sight. Again, for assessing this area in decoding, we can use standardized assessments. Both the Wyatt and the KTEA each have subtests that measure this skill. You can also measure it using things like DIBELS or other locally developed measures. We're always going to use non-words or nonsense words so that we can really isolate and access the skill of decoding specifically. By using these nonsense words, we remove the possibility that the child could recognize or read the word based on sight or based on memory or previous experience. And it really forces students to bring those decoding and those phonological skills online and allows us to evaluate their ability in that isolated area. When we assess reading fluency, we're looking at the student's ability to perform reading with appropriate speed as well as accuracy. This is most often measured with curriculum-based techniques, but in some of the newer revisions, like the new Wyatt and the new KTEA, they include a subtest that also measures oral reading fluency. So it used to be we would only evaluate fluency with a curriculum-based or a locally developed assessment. Some of the big test publishers are now recognizing this area as having greater importance. It is now a sub-area of learning disability federally, so I think that's one of the reasons why we see this included in the new revisions of the standardized published tests. But either way, we can evaluate a student's fluency. Students' fluency will always be evaluated or assessed under time conditions because of that rate component. So there will always be a time constraint or a measurement of time so that we can determine the student's rate of reading. We're concerned not only with the speed but also with the accuracy. And reading comprehension is highly correlated with reading fluency. So meaning that students who are fluent readers, we have found are often also readers who can comprehend what they're reading. It's thought that by taking away that component of reading and the laborious getting through the text by decoding things, sound by sound, and really spending a lot of time getting through the words, when we remove that and we make that a more fluent process, students are freed up then to have more time to consider what they're reading, to reflect on the meaning of the text, and then it really gives them a lot more mental energy to focus on comprehension versus spending so much time on decoding. Reading fluency is an area that is extremely sensitive to change. It makes it a great technique for progress monitoring, especially in an RTI paradigm, both because it's quick to do, it's easy to see changes rapidly over time, and as I mentioned, it's highly correlated with other skills such as comprehension. So it's a good way for us to kind of check the pulse of a student and see if interventions are effective, and we can, with reasonable certainty, know that if they're doing well in reading comprehension, that they're doing well in other academic areas as well. Within the broader area of comprehension, there are several sub-areas, including literal comprehension. These are sometimes referred to as right there questions, or questions where students can go back in the passage and find the answer exactly as it was stated. Inferencing questions require students to extend beyond what's explicitly stated in the text and make inferences, make predictions, read between the lines a little bit. This is a difficult skill for many students and is one of the higher level techniques of reading comprehension. The area of vocabulary and the ability to sequence a story in logical order also falls under the category of comprehension as well. Your text does a nice job explaining a little bit more about each of these sub areas, so I would refer you there for a more complete understanding. Make sure that you read that section. They do a nice job differentiating these skills and talking about how they're each related to one another and how they're relevant in the broader category of comprehension. Again, we have the option of using standardized norm reference tests to measure reading comprehension, as well as classroom-based strategies. Really, a gold standard would be to use both in combination for any type of IEP development, intervention development, and certainly to monitor students' progress. It is important to differentiate the student's literal versus inferential comprehension because oftentimes students will have difficulty with one. Sometimes they have difficulty with both, but the intervention approach is going to be very different and targeted more specifically regarding which area that they struggle with greater. Different strategies go into strengthening literal versus inferential comprehension. Closed procedures are an informal technique. They're considered an informal assessment to determine if a student is reading, to determine if the selection that the student is reading, rather, is at their instructional level. So closed procedures are a great way to make sure that you are utilizing text that is at your student's instructional level, meaning that there is something for them to learn, that there's room for them to grow in that text, but that the text is not overly frustrating. To create a closed passage, we will typically leave the first and last sentences of the passage unaltered. We will leave them intact. Otherwise, we will delete every fifth word from the passage and we will replace that with a blank. When the student reads through the passage, he or she has to fill in the blanks with a word that would make sense based on the context of the story. We know that the student is working in a text that is at his or her instructional level if they supply between 44 and 57% of the missing words correctly. We know we're in the right zone. Again, they have room to grow. There's ways that we can instruct and have the student learn at this level, but they would not be overly frustrated. It's a good measure of comprehension. It's also a good intervention for comprehension if used that way. It forces the student to really pay attention to context clues and use those to make choices. A maze procedure is very similar to closed. It's the same overall procedure, except instead of having a blank, the student would have a choice to fill in that blank. So instead of just having a blank area where the student has to generate their own response, In that blank, there would be a choice of 3 words. One of them would be correct, and the student would have to make a choice from 3, which word most correctly fills in the blank. The last several slides here are your learning objectives for Chapter 10. The learning objectives for Chapters 10 through 12 will be reflected on the last slides in each presentation. So look here for your study guide and a little bit of guidance for preparing for the quiz rather than a separate learning objectives worksheet as we've had in the past.